I want to continue asking the question, does God exist? In his 1882 collection, Die Freiliche Wissenschaft, which is German for the joyful pursuit of knowledge and understanding, German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche wrote these words. He said, God is dead. God remains dead. And we have killed him. How shall we comfort ourselves, the murderers of all murderers? What was holiest and mightiest of all that the world has yet owned has bled to death under our knives. Who will wipe this blood from us? What water is there for us to clean ourselves? What festivals of atonement, what sacred games shall we have to invent? Is not the greatness of this deed too great for us? Must we ourselves not become gods simply to appear worthy of it? Friedrich Nietzsche is now famous for his proclamation that God is dead. Now, in his mind, enlightened thinkers had reasoned God out of existence. And so his thought process was, how can we fill the void that's left by this abandonment of God, by this abandonment of an objective moral standard? Nietzsche thought, and rightly so I think, that without God, objective morality cannot exist. So intellectually, he acknowledged that. But practically, in his actual real life, he couldn't live like that. So shortly before he went insane and had to be institutionalized, he was in Turin, Italy, and he came across a man, just encountered him on the street, who was mercilessly just whipping his horse with his whip. He was trying to get this horse to move this cart, and he was just, going way overboard with his whip. And so Nietzsche just bursts into tears, and he runs across the street and throws himself around the neck of this horse to save this horse from the blows of its cruel master. Now, that story's famous, but what makes it really interesting for our discussion tonight is that even Nietzsche, who's one of the most famous philosophers of all time, and who's famous specifically for the proclamation that God is dead, and famous for his then thoughts about how we can fill the moral void that's left by the death of God. Even he, though he intellectually acknowledged that we can't have morality without God, he couldn't live like that. Even in his mind, there were things that were actually wrong. There were things that were actually bad. And therefore we conclude there are things that were actually good and actually right. So our question tonight is, if God does not exist, then is it possible to have objective morality? Is it possible to have good and bad? Is it possible to have right and wrong? And we're going back to the well, I guess, the phrase that we talked about last time. Objective morality cannot be based on subjective humanity. Objective morality cannot be based on subjective humanity. And as we discuss this, particularly as it pertains to the existence of God, we're discussing this argument. We called it last time the morality argument. And here it is in its most basic form. If God does not exist, then objective moral values and duties do not exist. Objective moral values and duties do exist, therefore God exists. Now, as you can see, it's logically airtight. There's no problem logically with this. Like if the two premises, if number 1 and number 2 are true, then number 3 is also true. The conclusion is also true. So what we have to do is explore the first 2 lines of this, the first 2 premises. And if they're true, then we can also say with conviction that number 3, that the conclusion that God does exist is also true. Now, last time we talked about the first premise of this argument, that if God does not exist, then objective moral values and duties don't exist. So we won't rehash that. But I do want to go back over the definitions because we're using these words in a specific way in this context. So let's just go right over them really quickly again. First of all, morality. This is probably the most basic one for us. It just has to do with how we live, what we do with our lives, that kind of thing, a standard for morality, right? We actually use this one pretty often in our everyday lives. Now, moral values pertain to what's good and bad. So when I evaluate something, I'm putting a value on it. I'm saying it's good or it's bad. So that's what values mean in this context, good and bad. Duties refer to right and wrong. Right and wrong. Now, those last 2, values and duties, may seem like the same thing. But remember last time we talked about how there is a distinction between the 2 that's pretty important for our discussion. Because there are some things that are good that are not necessarily right, that we don't have to do. There are some things that are bad that are not necessarily wrong. We don't have not to do them, right? So like we said last time, it would be good for all of us probably to become doctors, at least a lot of us. That would be a good thing. Being a doctor is a good thing. You're helping care for other people. But we don't have to become doctors, right? Otherwise, most of us would be in trouble. I guess Dr. Dale will be fine. Somebody else may be fine in here. But if we had to become doctors, we would be in trouble, right? But we don't have to. It's a good thing, but it's not a duty. It's not an obligation. So there are some things that are good to do that we don't have to do. And there are some things that are bad to do, like eating a donut, that we don't have not to do, right? We don't have to never eat a donut. So that's the difference between values and duties. Now, when we talk about objective, this is maybe the key definition for our discussion. Because when we say that something is objectively true, we're saying that it's true whether I believe it or not, whether you believe it or not. We're saying that it's true independent of anybody's opinions. So when we say that something is subjective, we're saying that it's dependent on people's opinions. But objective is the opposite of that. So when we say that something is objective, we're saying that it's binding on all people at all times. So it doesn't matter if everybody disagrees with it. It doesn't matter if I disagree with it. It doesn't matter if I don't even know that it exists. It still is objectively true. So, for example, like we talked about last time, even if the Nazis had won World War II, and they either convinced everybody who disagreed with them that what they did was right, or they wiped out everybody who disagreed with them. So, in either of those cases, everybody on earth actually agrees that what the Nazis did was good and right. But in reality, what they did would still have been bad and wrong, right? So that's what we mean when we say that there are objective moral values and duties. There are things that are good, and there are things that are bad. There are things that are right. There are things that are wrong. No matter what anybody thinks of them. We could have universal consensus around the world that something is the case, and it could actually still not be the case. So that's what we mean when we talk about objective. Now, let's look at the second premise of this argument, that objective moral values and duties do exist. Now, what this is saying is things like child abuse and racism and terrorism are wrong for all people at all times in all places. And as we dive into this discussion, I want to say something that I'm going to try to keep this as like tame of a level as I can, I guess. But there are some things that might be a little sensitive that we have to talk about, because when we talk about morality, there are some things in the middle that people disagree on. There are some things that we would think are good, that we would think are right, that not everybody agrees are good and right? Because we have a different worldview. We have a different system by which we determine our morality. So there are some things that we would disagree on, but there are some things that almost everybody on earth agrees are good and agrees are bad. So we're going to try to stick to the extreme so we can appeal to people who don't think like us. Because if we're talking about the existence of God, we're probably talking to people who think very differently than us, right? Talking to atheists, talking to agnostics. So I want to make that disclaimer. Now, most atheists and theists, most people agree with this premise, actually, that objective moral values and duties do exist. But some atheists deny it. So this is a quote from Michael Roos, who is a professor at Florida State University. He's a philosopher. He's an atheist. He says, "Morality is a biological adaptation, no less than our hands and feet and teeth. Considered as a rationally justifiable set of claims about an objective something, ethics is illusory. Morality is just an aid to survival and reproduction, and any deeper meaning is illusory." Now, that's a lot of words, right? But basically he's saying that morality is something that we make up, that just happened through evolution. We'll talk about that more in a minute. But if atheism is true, I see no reason why he is wrong. If atheism is true, we can say that some action, just think of an action that almost everybody agrees is actually objectively wrong. Let's just take murder. So let's say murder may not be socially advantageous. It may not be good for our society. And so in the course of human evolution, it just has been ground into us that murder is a bad thing to do, that it is a wrong thing to do. But that does absolutely nothing to prove that murder is actually really wrong. So without God, there isn't any absolute right and wrong that just binds itself on our consciences. So if atheism is true, then objective moral values and duties do not exist. The opposite of our premise, right? But is that actually the case? Do these values and duties not exist? Now, I want to say something as we kind of dive into this discussion, and that is, I believe that objective moral values and duties exist because I believe in God. I believe that He's the standard for our morality. But I'm not sure if I can convince an atheist that objective moral values and duties don't exist, if they don't already believe that. So this is something that most people on earth believe. Like, I would say over 90% of people agree that there are objective moral values and duties. Even if they don't realize it, they believe, like we've said, that some things are good and some things are bad, regardless of what anybody thinks. But I'm not sure if we can convince somebody of that. That's something that I'm still thinking about, but I wanted to put that out there. I want to be honest with you and say this might not be convincing to everybody, because the argument for objective moral values and duties is mainly from our intuition. So we all have a very strong intuition that there are some things that are right and some things that are wrong. We have this feeling inside, right, that I can't just walk up to somebody on the street and murder them. Like, that's not okay. That's actually wrong, right? So we all have this sense, or at least almost everybody on earth has this sense. So we're arguing from that sense. So this isn't necessarily going to convince someone who doesn't believe in objective morals. We would talk about other arguments for God. But for somebody who does believe in objective morals, this is incredibly convincing. That's why I think it's the most convincing argument for most people for God. Because if you believe in objective morals, then I think this argument is pretty hard to escape. So, if we accept what Mr. Roos says, that it's just the biological adaptation, morality is, then we're forced to say that there is no moral difference between taking a child into your arms and loving that child, nurturing that child, hugging that child, and someone else taking that same child into their arms and doing awful things, like torturing the child. So we're forced to say that there's no moral difference between those two, if morality does not exist, if we ignore our intuitions. Now, I ask this question not because I think anybody in here would respond to it in a negative way, but because I think it's a question that's fair for somebody who's not sure whether or not God exists. And that's the question, are we prepared to say that those two actions actually have no moral difference? That loving a child and torturing a child are actually on the same moral plane? Now, if God does not exist, then we're forced into that conclusion. So the question that we have to ask our skeptic friends, like in a friendly way, is, are we really going to live like that? Are we going to ignore all of our intuitions? So most people believe that things like racism and torture and murder, terrorism, stealing, child abuse are wrong for all people at all times and all places, no matter the circumstances, and no matter whether they agree with it or not, right? And most people would think that things like love and equality and tolerance and justice and self-sacrifice, generosity, all of these values and duties are actually good and right for all people at all times and all places. So if you believe that some of those things are wrong, if you believe that any of those things are right, then you actually believe in objective morality. Now, I would argue that people who can't see the difference between those two actions are actually morally handicapped, that they are comparable to somebody who is physically blind. Now, somebody who is physically blind cannot see the world around them, right? They don't have an accurate perception of the world around them. Now, that doesn't make them inferior in any way in quality to other humans, but it's just part of being blind, right? You can't see what is around you. You don't have the perception that people who can see have of the world around them. But just because somebody who is blind can't see the world like you can, doesn't cause you to doubt how you see the world, right? So just because somebody who is blind can't see these pews, it doesn't cause you to doubt that these pews actually exist, right? Now, just like that, I would argue that somebody who can't see these objective moral values and duties, that can't see the difference between loving a child and torturing a child, somebody who can't see the moral difference between those two things is morally handicapped. They're morally blind. But their moral handicap shouldn't cause us to doubt our strong moral intuitions. So how does the atheist respond to this? Because obviously, hopefully, they've thought through their worldview and they have reasons for why they believe the way that they do. So how do they respond to this? The most common response is along the lines of what Michael Roos said, that basically we have morality as a biological adaptation through evolution. So through billions of years, evolution has produced a creature that's capable of giving praise to things, giving negative feelings toward things, that's capable of self-reflection, all these different things that we think about with morality. And then society has conditioned that creature, us creatures, to think that certain things are right and wrong. Now, we might call this the herd mentality, that basically everybody on earth has come to believe that some things are good and some things are bad. Therefore, everybody on earth thinks that some things are good and some things are bad. So when we call it a herd mentality, that's not derogatory. That's actually the atheist's word. So this is a quote from Bertrand Russell, who was a very famous British agnostic from the last century. He said, "The ethics arises from the pressures of the community on the individual. Man does not always instinctively feel the desires which are useful to his herd." Now, remember, evolutionary scientists think of us as animals that are useful to his herd. The herd, being anxious that the individual should act in its interest, that is the interest of the herd, has invented various devices for causing the individual's interest to be in harmony with that of the herd. One of these is morality. So basically, the atheist says that morality is just developed in us via pressure from society. It's a kind of moral peer pressure. So that's by far and away the most common atheist response to this argument. And it may sound pretty good on the surface. Like, if you accept evolution, we may could see how these morals could be ground into us in some way through these billions of years. But when you think about it, even if that were true, even if evolution were true, and even if it's true that it had ground into us these moral beliefs, that wouldn't say anything about whether or not these moral beliefs are actually true or not, right? Think about it. To argue like this is to commit what's called the genetic fallacy. Now, let me give you an example of the genetic fallacy. So I could walk up to you, and I could say that the only reason that you believe that democracy is the best form of government is because you were reared in the United States of America. Now, that might be true. You might believe that democracy is the best form of government, and you might only believe that because you were reared in the U.S. But that actually has nothing to do with whether or not democracy is the best form of government, right? Like, it doesn't matter how you came to believe something. It doesn't make it true or false. So that's what's called the genetic fallacy, trying to argue from someone's genetics, how someone arrived at a conclusion, and then argue against the conclusion. It actually has nothing to do with whether or not the conclusion is true or false. So how someone came to believe in something doesn't say anything about the truth of that belief. If God exists, then he is the foundation of moral values and duties, no matter how we learn about them. So William Lane Craig is an American philosopher and apologist, and he said, if moral values and duties objectively exist and are grounded in God, then our gradual, fallible apprehension of the moral realm does nothing more to undermine the objectivity of that realm than our gradual, fallible apprehension of the physical world undermines the objectivity of the physical world around us. In both cases, there's an objective reality of which we have a gradual, fallible apprehension. What's he saying? He's saying that just like we haven't seen anything in the physical world, or seen everything in the physical world, that doesn't mean that it doesn't exist, right? So I've never been to Fayetteville, Arkansas. Some of you have, and so some of you can tell me that Fayetteville, Arkansas actually does exist. But am I supposed to believe you? Like, am I supposed to just believe that it exists even though I haven't seen it? So that's what he's talking about, our gradual, fallible apprehension. I haven't seen all of the physical world. I haven't seen Fayetteville, Arkansas. But it doesn't cause me to doubt that Fayetteville, Arkansas actually exists because I have testimony from a whole lot of people that I trust, hopefully. But anyway, so that's gradual, fallible apprehension of the physical world, right? We're gradually, fallibly apprehending our physical world. We're understanding it more and more every day. We see new things every day. But that doesn't mean that it didn't exist before we came to know it. Now, in the same way with morality, just because we might not understand everything when it comes to morality doesn't mean that those moral values and duties don't exist. So, objective moral values and duties do exist. Now, that leads us to the conclusion that, therefore, God exists. Catherine Tate was the only daughter of Bertrand Russell, and we've referenced him in this study. He was a very famous British agnostic from the last century. She wrote a book entitled My Father, Bertrand Russell, and in this book, she recounted what it was like to grow up in the Russell household. She commented, for example, that her father firmly believed that parents should teach a child, quote, with its very first breath, that it has entered into a moral world. But her father had a very hard time defending that position. So as you can imagine, as you parents can imagine, trying to tell your child without God, without the Bible, that we have morals and that we should act in a certain way is very tough. So she recounted that when she was a child growing up, her father would tell her, you should do this or you should do that. You should not do this. You should not do that. And she would say, but why? Well, why should I do that or not? I'm sure all parents have heard that question, right? So she would ask, I don't want to. Why should I? She said that a normal parent might respond by saying, well, because I say so, or because your father says so, or because God says so. But Bertrand Russell was not your average parent. He would respond by saying, because more people will be happy if you do than if you don't. Now, she would respond to that, I don't care. Why should I care whether people are happy or not? So her father would respond to that by saying, oh, but you should. This is a quote from her. So I don't care. Oh, but you should. And she would say, but why? To which her father would then respond with the same thing he said in the beginning. Because more people will be happy if you do than if you don't. Now, in the end, Mrs. Tate wrote that we felt the heavy pressure of his rectitude and obeyed. But the reason was not convincing, neither to us nor to him. Now, what she's saying is that if we don't have objective moral values and duties, if we don't have a higher being, a higher standard by which we must live, how can we determine how to live? Is it not just a battle between my opinion versus your opinion? And if I convince more people that I'm right, then I win, and I can squash your view. Or if you convince more people that you're right, you win, you can squash my view. Do we really want to go that way? So without God, what basis do we have for equality, for tolerance, for love, for justice, for all of these things that we hopefully all think are good, that we hopefully all think are right? If you believe in those things, then I think you also should believe in God. Now, this whole discussion brings up the question, what is our basis for morality? What is the standard for our actions? How do we determine whether something is good or bad? How do we determine whether something is right or wrong? Now, for the people in this room, our automatic answer is probably that the Bible is our standard for morality, right? Now, I would actually argue that that's not the case. Now, that doesn't mean that the Bible is not essential in trying to determine our morality, right? Trying to figure out what's good and bad, trying to figure out what's right or wrong. That doesn't discount the Bible's role that it plays in this. But I would argue that our standard for morality is actually God himself. It comes from the nature of God. So what's good is good because it is from the nature of God. What's bad is bad because it is not from the nature of God. For example, I think we're safe in saying that God's most basic attribute is love. 1 John 4:8, God is love. But listen to what comes before that. 1 John chapter 4, verses 7 and 8. Beloved, let us love one another. Because love is of God. And everyone who loves is born of God and knows God. He who does not love does not know God, for God is love. Notice the argument in this text. He's arguing from God's character to our character. He's saying we should love one another because God loves us. Now, this is all over the New Testament. This line of thinking is all over the New Testament. I'll give you a few examples. Matthew 5:48. Therefore, you shall be perfect. You shall be complete because your heavenly Father, just as your Father in heaven, is perfect. Luke 6:36. Therefore, be merciful, just as your Father also is merciful. 1 Peter 1:16. Be holy, for I am holy. Why are we not supposed to lie? Colossians 3:9. Because God does not lie. Hebrews 6:18. So this is all over the New Testament. There are many more examples that we could look at. But notice in all of those texts, they're arguing from the character of God, from the nature of God, saying that God is like this, so you should also be like this. So in all of those texts, they're arguing from the nature of God toward our nature, toward our character. So God is the standard of moral values and duties, just like a live performance is the standard for a recording. So take a recording of an artist. I know that we have a couple Elvis fans, at least, in this room, not looking at anybody. But so let's take a recording of Elvis. Now, if you have a recording of Elvis that comes on the radio, the standard of that recording, like how good or bad it is, depends on how staticky that recording is, right? Like if it's super staticky, if it's jumpy, then it's not a very good recording because it's not close to what Elvis actually sounded like. Now, just like that, the more closely a moral action conforms to God's nature, the better it is. C.S. Lewis was absolutely brilliant, but this is one thing he said as it pertains to this. He said, the divine goodness differs from ours, but it is not sheerly different. It differs from ours not as white from black, but as a perfect circle from a child's first attempt to draw a wheel. So in other words, we're taking God's goodness, God's character as the standard of morality. We're saying that if it's good because God is that. If it's bad because God is not that. Now, our goodness, our morality, as we try to emulate God, it's just like that child's first attempt to draw a circle. We're trying to get as close to the perfect circle to God's character as we can. But oftentimes we mess up. And just like a child's circle, or me trying to draw a circle, it's just squiggly lines all over, right? So that's what our lives often look like as we try to emulate the character of God. One other illustration to hopefully help us grasp this is the meter step in France. So this is the standard of meters. I didn't know this existed, but it's in Paris, France, and this is the meter. Like if you have a meter, it has to be this length, the length of this step. Every meter in the entire world is only a meter if it measures up with this meter step in Paris, France. So just like that, God's nature is the standard of morality. To be specific, moral values come from the very character of God. So what's good and what's bad depends on God's nature. And then that nature has expressed itself in the form of commands, right? That's what we have in the Bible. We have commands from God. And we have those moral duties that we have come from those commands. So his commands, which issue from his nature, inform us of right and wrong. Now, just a couple texts that help us to illustrate this. Psalm 119, verse 68, we see both values and duties in this text. You are good and do good. Teach me your statutes. You are good. That's the nature of God, the character of God, right? So we would say that God is good. His nature, his character is good. Therefore, we should also be good. And then we see our duties in the end of that verse, teach me your statutes. So we have our moral values, they come from who God is, and our moral duties come from what God has revealed to us. And actually, those moral duties, those commands, issue from the nature of God. So we said that the most basic attribute of God is love. So that's why we're supposed to love our enemies, because God is love. So everything stems from the nature of God. So our commands that we have, like the command to love our enemies, is only a command because God is like that, because God loves his enemies. One other text that shows us especially our duties is Micah chapter 6 and verse 8. It says, he has told you, O man, what is good. And what does the Lord require of you but to do justice and to love kindness and to walk humbly with your God. In that text, we can clearly see some of our moral duties. We should do this, we should not do this, because this is right, this is wrong. Now, if I can ask a favor of you, raise your hand if you watched any of the Olympics this summer. Just saw any clips, live, recorded, anything like that. Okay, so I don't think I saw a single second of the Olympics live. But I saw some clips after they happened. And one clip I saw was from the opening ceremony of the Olympics. Now, this was absolutely breathtaking. If you didn't see it, I would definitely look it up because it was really cool. This globe, I think, was made of drones that were actually in the air flying around. It was really cool to see. But as part of this opening ceremony, they played the song Imagine by John Lennon. Now, as we start to say this, I don't have anything inherently against the Beatles or this song. The song's super catchy. But listen to the first words of this song. Imagine there's no heaven. It's easy if you try. No hell below us, above us, only sky. Now, like I said, I don't have anything inherently against John Lennon, and this song will get stuck in your head if you listen to it. I promise. It's been stuck in my head all week. But the way this song was played at the Olympics, it was very clear that it was a kind of secular anthem. It was a song that was meant to draw us together, to get rid of our differences and draw us together as one. Now, what's really ironic is, I think the next line in the song is, imagine there's no countries, no nations, and they played this just after, all the countries marched out. So it was an interesting song choice. But anyway, it was very clear that it was meant to draw us together on things that we can't agree on. So imagine there's no heaven. Imagine there's no hell. Now, to be honest, it's hard for me to imagine anything worse than that, because think about this. In this imaginary world where there is no heaven and there is no hell, there also cannot be any final absolute criteria to determine good and evil. So there's no way to determine between one person's opinions and another person's opinions. So this is an invitation into a very dangerous space, because once we take God out of the picture, anything is permitted. If you don't believe me, look at your history books from the last century. There were several people in very powerful political and cultural spaces who didn't believe in God. They didn't believe that there was a heaven. They didn't believe that there was a hell. And they literally piled up corpses by the millions. So to me, this isn't something to get dreamy-eyed about. It's a very dangerous proposition. Now, to make this real life and to give you a real-life example of where this leads, this is a man named Richard Vermont. He was imprisoned in a Soviet communist prison in Romania for 10 years. He was imprisoned and tortured. Now, he survived that ordeal, and later on he wrote a book called Tortured for Christ. And in this book, he wrote this: the cruelty of atheism is hard to believe when one man has no faith in the reward of good or the punishment of evil. There is no reason to be human. There is no restraint from the depths of evil which is in man. The communist torturers often said, listen to this, there is no God, no hereafter, no punishment for evil. We can do what we wish. I have heard one torturer even say, I thank God, in whom I don't believe, that I have lived to this hour when I can express all the evil in my heart. Vermont wrote, he expressed it in unbelievable brutality and torture inflicted on prisoners. Now, God proposes a different way. And his way, I would argue, is always right. Now, imagine if we all lived like him. If you want to begin that journey tonight, won't you do it as we stand and as we sing?